So if you could please change your name to the name that you provide in the registration. Um, Also, if you are a winner of the raffle, we will be contacting you via email. Uh, I am very pleased to be the person introducing Dr. Eduardo Arellano for this session. Dr. Eduardo Arellano is an associate professor in higher education, uh, administration, and the director of the master's degree program in higher education leadership at the University of Texas at El Paso. He has taught a wide breadth of higher education administration, policy, and research courses using multiple modalities for the last 19 years. As a faculty member, he has led and been an integral part of many governance committees at the department, college, and campus-wide levels. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's degree in public administration, and a doctorate in higher education administration. So without further ado, it is my great privilege to present to you Dr. Eduardo Arellano.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I hope that you had a good lunch, but hopefully not one that will lull you to sleep. And if you do fall asleep, you can blame it on my presentation if you'd like. My goal this afternoon is for you to be able to ask me questions after my presentation. And if not, I definitely have some questions that I'd like to ask you since this is the first time that I present on this topic. When I first learned about the theme of the transformative power of education, I thought, how apropos, since I'm teaching a course in organizational change in higher education. And so this afternoon, I thought I would share with you a model of how we can plan an organizational change. But before I do that, let me preface with some beginning points. Next slide, please. The first is that leadership can be learned. I'm working from that idea because while some of us might have the raw talent for leadership, there are some knowledge, skills, and mindsets that we can improve upon for our potential and actual leadership. Long gone are the days when people believed that, can you stay on the first slide, on the first bullet, please? Thank you, sorry. Long gone are the days when people thought that, a leadership was granted by a higher being, although we still have vestiges of this. But in our leadership programs, we try to combat these archaic ideas. The second point, please. The second point is that leadership is not limited to assigned positions. So whether our formal titles are instructors, advisors, or tutors, we all have the opportunity to provide leadership to our department or our institution. Third point. The third point is that my presentation is focused on planned organizational change. If there's one constant in our reality, it's change, right? Change happens, whether we like it or not, whether we plan for it or not. And the evidence of that most recently has been this pandemic, right? But what I'm arguing here is that even in times of crisis, we have the opportunity to plan for change. And in fact, we have the opportunity to have a desired future after a crisis. And this is a special time to do that. Next point. The last beginning point that I want to share is that these recommendations that I'm making to you can be used either for a specific organizational unit, such as the department or program or office, and it can also be used for entire campuses, for other organizations, and even for community-wide initiatives. And then the last point. The last point that I wanted to share with you is that this presentation is from different fountains of knowledge, and some of them I'll be sharing them throughout the presentation. So now let me discuss with you the 5 steps of the planning model that I'd like to share with you. Thank you, Lorena. The first step is to develop a comprehensive organizational profile. The reason we want to do this is so that we have a full picture of our current circumstances, whether it's as a department or as a campus. In order to do this, we've got to do a number of things. First step, please. First point. Or all points at the same time, that's okay. The first is for us to analyze what our current mission or vision and our purpose is, so that not only in terms of its clarity, but in terms of to what extent we're actually fulfilling our mission, vision, and purpose. We also should analyze our current goals and strategies in terms of to what extent are they actually aligned to our mission and vision. And in terms of structure, what I'm referring there is our organizational chart. What are those semi-permanent aspects of our organization that we should take a close look at? For example, our bylaws, our written policies, our written processes. However, it's not enough to look at what we have in writing and what we have, in a diagram, for example, but we also have to analyze what are those unwritten rules, those unwritten policies that some of us may not want to address. And then the fourth is to look at our geographic scope of, in other words, the coverage of our service, right? And what are the needs of our service area, especially in terms of education and other related social needs. And lastly, we should look at it, develop a descriptive list of our stakeholders so that we can make sure that whatever organizational change we plan, it includes those stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the next step is to conduct what is called a SWOT analysis. So I'm going to explain to you what each of those letters in SWOT means if you're not familiar with that. So first point. The S stands for strengths, and that's where we need to ask ourselves, what are our assets? What services do we do well? Next point. For W, that's weaknesses. So there we ask ourselves, what is it that we need to improve? What are our challenges? What are our real problems? Next point. And then O stands for opportunities. What can we build on? Once we consider our strengths, what is it that we can actually do even better given our strengths? And the last one, thank you, is threats. What's stopping us from taking advantage of those possible opportunities that we have for our future? Next slide. The next step is to develop an actual change proposal. So in order to do this, we have to use the organizational profile and also the SWOT analysis so that we can develop a proposal. Next point. Second point. So when we're developing the change proposal, just as we have a mission, vision, and purpose for our unit or our campus, we should develop a specific one for our change proposal. Next point. And again, similar to our department or our campus, we should develop specific goals and strategies for our change proposal. And it's important to point out here that the goals should be clear and they should be feasible. Next point. And similarly to when we were doing the organizational profile, we want to identify those stakeholders that should be included in our in our proposal. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the last point, which was to conduct a SWOT analysis for the proposal itself. And the reason why we want to do this is it's sort of like a second check to see if there's anything that we need to go back and maybe possibly make additional changes to our proposal. Thank you, Lorena. Next step is to develop a communication plan. So once we have the proposal, there's several constituencies that we're going to have to convince in terms of whether we need this proposal, this change, and then how we can actually foster support for it. So the first point that should be included in our plan is that we need to develop different message goals for different audiences because different groups, there's different arguments that appeal to different groups, I should say. Next point. And we should expect and prepare for resistance in our communication plan. Third point. And so we need to develop compelling presentations and materials. Again, they need to be different for different audiences because again, different arguments are going to appeal to different groups. Next point. And of course, we need to use multiple communication channels. Most recently, people, I think, rely a lot on social media, but there are still other, what I would call more traditional media that we should also take advantage of. Again, taking into consideration the different audiences that we're trying to convince. And then lastly, we need to build in regular progress reports of the change and feedback loops. We want to, communicate how things are going to our different stakeholders in terms of the change, and give them an opportunity to give us feedback in terms of the change, the change that is concerned, so that using that feedback, we might need to make additional changes to our plan. Next. And then the last step is to develop an evaluation plan. So the first point I want to make as far as this is concerned is that you want to involve the stakeholders who are actually going to use the evaluation to actually help you design the evaluation. Next point. So we then need to determine the focus of the evaluation. Next. And we need to determine the data that we need to conduct the evaluation. And some of this data may be already pre-existing, and it may be quantitative, it may be qualitative. Next point. And we need to determine how the data will be collected and used. And then lastly, we need to choose or develop instruments to collect the data. And what I mean by instruments, they may be surveys, they may be interviews, or as I said earlier, they might be pre-existing data sets. I should also say that there might be a possibility that there might be an existing survey that you can use rather than you having to develop your own. It just depends on the focus of your evaluation. Next slide. So there's some additional issues that I wanted to discuss with you as far as planning and organizational change. First of all, and this is probably obvious to a lot of you, there are other planning models that you could use. There are traditional charrettes that I've seen that have been effective. I just most recently learned of another planning model called SOAR, in which the letter stands for strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. And there may even be specific planning models for specific purposes. So for example, if the issue that you want to address has to do with diversity, there are specific planning models for diversity initiatives, for example. Next point. The other thing to consider is the life stage of the organization. So there are some organizations that are brand new. I mean, they're maybe a year, 2 or 3 years old. And so what the research has shown us is that those organizations that are fairly new are more receptive to change, as opposed to the more mature organizations that have been around for decades, maybe centuries. They tend to be more resistant to change. Next point. And I want to especially emphasize here that personal leadership matters too. What the research has shown us is that qualities such as preparation, patience, courage, and insight, among other qualities, help in us being effective change agents. Next slide, please. So these are the references that I used primarily for this presentation, but there were others that I drew from either experience or just my own personal insight. And as I mentioned earlier, I was able to use some of my materials for the course that I teach for this presentation. Next slide. Thank you all very much. You can see my name there, my email, and my phone number. If you found this presentation useful, please know that this is just a taste of the kind of information you can gain access to as a master's or doctoral student in our higher education leadership programs here at UTEP. So if you're interested, I did ask the organizers to share a push card for both our master's and our doctoral program. Lorena, if you could put that up in the chat, I would appreciate it. So I would invite you to review those push cards and to ask any questions you may have in terms of our program. At this point, what I'd like to do is to ask if there are any questions that you might have.
Dr. Arellano, I do have one question from participants. Sorry.
Before you ask me the question, Marco, can we take off the presentation so that I can see people rather than looking at the slide that I'm looking at? Okay, thank you.
So the question is, what do you think is the best way to identify and prioritize potential changes on our campuses to help our students?
Well, I think the most important priority, right, and you would think that we wouldn't have to necessarily emphasize this, but I think even as institutions of higher education, we forget this. We have to remember that our first and foremost priority is learning, right? So how is it that we can change, whether we're a department or again, a full campus, how is it that we can change to address the learning needs of our students? And as I said earlier, when we are considering the learning needs of students, we also have to think about their social needs that are related to learning. Because as you know, to quote, I guess, a Spanish saying, las letras no entran si tienen uno hambre, right? You're not gonna learn if you're hungry, right? So we need to be very forthright and honest about the problems that are, making learning difficult. Other questions?
Another question is, with the given pandemic, there's going to be a lot of organizational change. How are we going to address the shortcomings of funding through our institutions?
So, there's actually, and I've done some reading on this, and there's been some research for some time now, and there's a debate among scholars and practitioners in this regard. Because of the challenges of funding, there's a camp that argues that administrators, other campus leaders need to be entrepreneurs, right? They need to be able to raise revenues, if you will, or develop resources in a way that is non-traditional, in a way that's more, I would argue, more of a corporate model. And then we have the other camp that says, no, we need to remind society that higher education, that education in general, is a public good. We need to just do a better job of convincing society that education is worth a public investment. We should not expect administrators, educational leaders to be entrepreneurs, to be, to follow the corporate model. Now, there is a middle road there, right? I would argue that the middle road there is that there are some business principles, if you wish to call them that, that we can incorporate. And then there's others where I think we need to hold fast on. And let me give you an example. One of the things we don't want to compromise is on addressing the needs of students, right? What that usually means is that if we're serious and genuine about addressing students' needs, that's labor intensive. That takes time. There may not be an efficient way of combating a certain problem. At the same time, I know this is not a higher education example, but I think it's a good example nonetheless. If you remember the children's television workshop, at one point their CEO, the CEO decided that they would allow for images of Sesame Street to be on products and to be sold so that they could use those revenues to continue that programming. That's an example where I think we can incorporate some business principles. We can learn from the corporate sector, but there are, I would argue that there are values and principles that we just we simply cannot adapt to, to a corporate model, if you will.
Yeah, along those same lines, there's an increasing competition from the private sector, both in higher education along and K-12. So based on your previous response, what are some of the ways in which public education, both the K-20, can engage with those challenges?
Well, that's a very good question, Marco. And I think what I would argue, and actually there's been, some literature that has suggested this too. And maybe you might have noticed this in the presentation, that one of the things I didn't discuss and I didn't address was this notion of institutions aspiring to be at a higher level, if you will. So what I would argue, the way that I would answer your question, the way that you want to address competition is to be true to yourself as an institution. Don't try to be something you're not. Find that little niche, if you will, that's responsive to your community. And you're not only not going to compete, but you're going to thrive. We've seen far too many colleges and universities aspire, and I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily an inherently bad thing to aspire, but they aspire to the point where they leave students behind, where they change their basic nature, where again, they become so corporate that it's hard to know what that identity is for that institution. So again, to kind of encapsulate my argument, you need to be true to yourself as an institution or as a department. Find that niche that is aligned to your values, rather than trying to be a kind of institution that that simply you cannot reach.
Thank you. And then we have one question from the chat. How do you feel identifying and applying these ideas in different organizations of different levels, or have you experienced differences when applying them at either K-12 through or higher education?
So, and I'm glad this question came up. I didn't specifically address K-12, although I would argue that the model that I'm proposing would work in K-12. What I wanted to share also is that when you do a SWOT analysis, right, or when you are analyzing your organization, you have to go beyond the perceptions, right, and actually get at the data, the evidence of your perceptions. So the way to do that is what I would call a modified Delphi process, and I've seen this work in small initiatives and in larger ones. What I mean by that is that individuals should be given the opportunity to identify what those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And then they can share that with a smaller group before it goes to a whole group. The reason we want to do that is because you want to avoid groupthink, right? Because you might feel as an individual reluctant to identify certain weaknesses, if you will. But in a smaller group, you might feel more comfortable doing that. And if there's people that have that same perception as you, as a group, you all might feel more comfortable bringing those uncomfortable issues up. But one thing I want to finish saying also in terms of this question is concerned, what we don't want to do is put problems under the rug, as they say. We need to be honest and face our problems directly. And I have to tell you that based on my experience, some of what I've witnessed and been part of, sometimes people are even uncomfortable with the word problem. They don't even want to call it a problem anymore, when that's in fact what it is. So we need to be honest.
Thank you. Another question is, there's an increasing amount of universities and colleges going through organizational change and closing or uniting departments. Is that an effective way for higher education to survive?
Yeah, it's, we have to admit, right, that the pandemic has been a big problem for higher ed. The last, article I saw, there were at least 500,000 people who lost their jobs in higher education. And as you mentioned, we've had entire academic programs, entire departments that have been dissolved. Overall, I would argue that that is not a positive development. And let me give you an example of why that is. Actually, I can give you an example and then make a larger argument. One example is we've seen, for example, some humanities programs, departments in philosophy, in creative writing, and so forth, that have been dissolved. My concern with that is that we also have, I think, a fairly valid knowledge base or research that tells us that one of the best ways that we can prepare our students, our future workers, is to make them more human. There are certain jobs, there are certain roles that no computer is ever going to be able to accomplish. To teach a group of kindergartners, there's not going to be a computer that is going to be able to, do everything that you have to do socially, intellectually, professionally, to maximize the learning of a kindergarten class. And so we need to still fight for those kinds of programs because, again, the research tells us that the future jobs are those in which we as individual workers have to show how we are more human than the computers or the technology that we're competing against. So that's my response.
Another question was, oops, I lost it, sorry. What are the negative changes which occur when we make large scale changes in an organization?
Well, and I want to go back to what I was talking about earlier, right? When you mention larger changes, what I'm thinking of, again, so many colleges and universities are wanting to be what are called aspirational institutions. So, for example, we have had small liberal arts colleges wanting to become comprehensive universities. We've had comprehensive universities wanting to become, Research One institutions. When you make such large, scale changes like that, again, like I mentioned before, you may lose your identity. You may lose students. You may lose, valuable employees. And so those are unfortunately, some of the negative consequences of aspiring, to what is considered the higher level, if you will. So I think institutions, just like individuals, we have to define what success means to us, right? And be honest about that.
Thank you. And then one more question is, how do you approach a department where you know that there needs to be change, but supervisors are adamant to change anything within their organization?
That's a great question. And this is something that, I discuss with my students time and time again. So from my perspective, from the research that I've seen, from my experience, you basically have two options. The first is to, as I said earlier, be patient, right? Try to make those changes. And a lot of times the change is cultural, if you will. And so anytime you want to make meaningful change within an organization, whether it's cultural or structural, it's going to take time. It's not going to be something that's going to happen from one day to the other. So one choice is to be patient and work towards that change as a leader, right? Your other choice is that even after you've attempted to make those changes and you haven't been successful, and the resistance is so great that it's like a wave, that's 30 feet that just engulfs you, then I think you need to make an honest assessment of yourself and make the determination that maybe you need to be in another institution or another department that's more aligned to your values, right? So I think that's the fork in the road, if you will. Try to change the organization. If after a certain amount of time, you realize it's not going to happen, go to another organization or another institution.
Thank you. And then similar to that, what can supervisors do to sort of encourage individuals to bring some of the needed change into the organization?
Well, right off the top, I would argue, professional development is key, right? We need to provide our students, our employees, and even administrators. We never should stop learning. So I would argue one way is to continually provide professional development. The other way, and it's kind of related to what I was talking about earlier, this phenomena of groupthink, right? Groupthink is when a group of people share a background so similar that they think similarly, and so sometimes they're not able to see reality, because they all have the same background and they all think alike. And when that happens, there's failure. And so as a leader, one of the things that you have to do is to develop some mechanisms where people can be honest in a way where they don't feel threatened, and there's different ways of doing that. It just depends on the culture of the institution. In some institutions, for example, you have these, I don't want to call them crisis hotlines because they're not crisis hotlines, but they are hotlines, where you can call in and make suggestions or you can make complaints. So I think, and then like I'm arguing here, there are ways that you can regularly program planning sessions that involve different stakeholders. That would be the third one that I would mention.
Thank you. Another question: having the mission of a college-going culture, what can we do as a community to standardize this within the culture?
Well, fortunately, some of that is happening. But what's unfortunate is that we see disparities, right, between those initiatives. Like, for example, I know that in some elementary schools, there's a lot of push in terms of attending, college, but it varies, right? Because you may go to another elementary school where that isn't happening, right? So I think what we need to do, again, and I know I'm not now going into K-12, but not only do we need to, if we're serious about, encouraging students to go to college, then we need to start at the earliest stages. But the other thing that we need to do, and again, research tells us this, is that we cannot, as educational systems, blame each other. What we see too often is we see the K-12 system blaming the higher ed system because they're the ones that produce the teachers that work, right? And the administrators that work in the K-12 systems. And the higher ed system blames the K-12 system because they say you're producing students that aren't prepared to go to college. So we want to avoid that. What we want to do is work together to actually address the problems. And there's a multitude of ways of doing that. One of the clear ways is by attempting to align, for example, the curricula, right, of high school to college, because sometimes there's a misalignment there, if you will. I think that, you'd be surprised. There have been studies, for example, that have shown that ethnic minority parents actually place more of a priority and emphasis on going to college than even white parents do. So I think one of the things that we need to stop doing too is thinking or assuming that when we're dealing with ethnic minority communities and parents, that we need to convince them that their children should go to college. We don't need to convince them. They're convinced. We need to support them. Now, unfortunately, because we're a migratory community here, we always have a significant portion of our students that are first generation students. And many of our parents, including my own, would not know how to support me other than what's obvious, right? But there are specific ways that parents can support their college going students. But if you don't know that, if you're not prepared to do that, that support isn't going to be there. So we need to prepare our parents in addition, to teachers, professors, in order to, foster that college going culture.
And is that a job for higher education institutions, or who can teach the parents and the community?
Well, what I'm arguing is that it should be a partnership of both systems. In fact, I was affiliated with a school, and I think the program is called Parent University, where we had a university professor that would go into this middle school and provide workshops to parents in terms of how to help their students, not only in middle school, but in high school and on into college. So again, I would argue that it's all our job, and we should work together. So I think as university professors, we should have, a foot in K-12 and vice versa. And we see that to some extent.
So is there any advice on how to prepare parents?
Well, like I said earlier, you have to be intentional. You have to have programs. You need to take into consideration what they bring, right, to whatever efforts you want to plan. You have to be responsive to the parents, right? Yeah, that's what I would say. These are really good questions, by the way.
Thank you. Another question, is there a specific planning model that focuses on immediate, temporary, institutional change as were required by the response of higher education to the pandemic?
Well, I guess, and I'm glad the question is there because, and I thought I would address this, but I thought, that maybe somebody will bring this up. So of course, one of the things that we're going to debate is what's considered as immediate, right? Because some folks would argue immediate means this particular semester. For other folks, immediate means a year. For others, it means 3 to 5 years, right? So I think it partly depends on, what you define as immediate. And then the other thing I want to share is that there's also a debate in terms of to what extent you should plan. There are some folks that argue that you really shouldn't plan, but maybe on an annual basis. Others who argue that you shouldn't go beyond 3 years. Some even criticize strategic plans that are 5 or more years old. So we have that debate in the society, right, in terms of like how far into the future should we plan. I can't think of a specific model that addresses it. But let me just say this, Mark, and for the audience. One of the things that I did not address in this presentation, because it's a whole other presentation, is that of crisis management. So I can tell you, well, if you define immediate as a crisis, that's a whole other body of knowledge, is crisis management. And I would have to develop a whole other presentation on how to manage crises.
That certainly would be a whole other topic. Another question, some policies from the state require that changes occur to occur. What is the best approach to dealing with this when the institution is required to change?
That's a very good question, and let me talk about it in an example, right? So, for example, not too long ago, the Texas legislature passed the law, and some of you might be familiar with this because I noticed that some of you are instructors at EPCC. The Texas legislature said that undergraduate instructors needed to provide their syllabi on the internet, right, or publicly available at least a year prior to actually teaching the class, right? So we have to follow the law, right, if we're teaching at the undergraduate level. So the question you're asking is, whoever asked the question is, well, how do we implement changes that are forced upon us, right? Sometimes we have no choice in terms of the timing is concerned, right? We're even given a deadline. We have to do it by such and such date. So we really have no recourse. Other than, for example, we can maybe grandmother students or grandfather students, whatever you feel more comfortable with, allow for other venues or other mechanisms for students to meet those changes. I know, for example, some academic programs have provided either a free class, or they've provided workshops so that even when the legislature compels certain changes, we can still prepare our students, but not necessarily punish them or hold them back. But that's a constant struggle, right? Because as academics, as professors, our profession tells us that we should be trusted with our expertise in terms of when we should have our syllabus ready, right? So to have policymakers tell us it's got to be a year before you teach is counterintuitive to what our profession tells us, right?
Yeah, thank you. And then I guess it's a two-pronged question. Because of the pandemic, obviously there had to be a lot of organizational change. So I guess people are interested in a little bit of that crisis management. And the second one is, can we say that we're still within that crisis management time?
Are we still in the crisis management mode?
Yes.
I think it depends on, the standard that you want to judge yourself against. And I think this is one of the problems or challenges that we've had with the pandemic, is that we differ in terms of when things will be, for lack of a better term, okay. For some of us, we'll be out of that crisis mode when we have reached herd immunity, right? Which, according to the researchers, the science that we've heard so far, means that 75 to 80 or more % of our population will be fully vaccinated. If we use that threshold, that benchmark, if you will, then we still have not left the crisis mode. My tendency is to err on the side of caution. So I would argue that we still are in that crisis mode. I don't think that we are out of the woods as far as that's concerned.
Thank you. One question, and it says, how can we help our students that come from Juarez and are taking college classes for the first time? In particular, how can we help them to bridge the gap in terms of different content and expectations?
Wow. I think you can probably develop a whole course on that, right? So it almost seems like it was a multi-parter. So give me the first part again, Marco.
How can we help our students that come from Juarez and are taking college classes for the first time?
Oh, college lessons for the first time. Wow. I think it's not much different from those students that we have that are not from Juarez in terms of the college. My goodness, I'm almost tempted to ask the audience that question. Because I mean, one strategy that I use as a professor, whether you come from Juarez or not, is I try to bridge the content to their lived reality, right? So that I capitalize on their interest. So I think that's one clear strategy, is to find out what are their interests and somehow connect your content to their lived realities, you know, to what's important to them. That would be one strategy. But man, I think that's a problem that would need, I think, multiple approaches for sure. Not anything I could answer in a minute or two for sure.
Yeah, it's a very loaded question. At this moment, I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself. We have about 4 minutes. Or if not, you can always post them on the chat box. And I'm sure that if your supervisor is here, they'll be, you know, tone deaf.
Well, let me ask, since nobody's asking questions, and if we just have a few minutes, I guess I'm curious, since this is the first time I present on this topic, I'm curious if anybody has any ideas in terms of what else you think should be included in an organizational profile. What else should we look at that I didn't mention?
Your mics are open now, so if you'd like to make a comment, your mics are open now. Please unmute yourself.
This is starting to feel like a real class.
If this is Frank Rimbach, I had a thought about, I'm always curious about what happens to graduates after they leave. So follow up, maybe 2-3 years. Did you go into your career? Did you pursue a second degree? Did you leave state? Like, how can we follow up on the success or the challenges that students have 2 or 3 years out after they leave a program? It seems like we lose touch with them at EPCC. I'm curious what UTEP does with that.
Well, you know, part of the truth of higher education is that we are so decentralized that the answer really depends on what academic program you're talking about. You know, so because, for example, I know, you know, UTEP has a pre-law program that does a fairly good job of systematically, you know, interviewing their students before they finish their pre-law program. You know, they have exit interviews in which they ask them for their contact information. So what I would suggest is for an academic program to formalize an exit interview, if you will, so that you can, you know, get the students' contact information beyond, you know, what they usually provide for the institution. Some of what I've heard too from academic programs and from institutions too, especially those that work in advancement, some students need to be assured that you're not collecting this information solely, you know, to ask for funds, if you will. But if you are, you know, clear with students as in terms of the purposes of why you want to stay in contact, I think that would go a long way. So if you tell students, you know, we want to stay in contact with you because maybe you can serve as a mentor for other students that will go through our program. You know, we want to be able to brag about your accomplishments. It isn't just about, you know, we don't just want your information so we can ask you for money, you know, after you become very successful. But that, and I, you know, there are some institutions that are better at developing, for example, alumni directory. And there are some programs that, you know, have very strong alumni clubs or associations. It just varies. So my advice would be, as an academic program, find out what others are doing that works and try to plan and implement those strategies for your particular academic program.
Thanks so much for the answer.
Sure.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're run out of time. But Dr. Arellano, we look forward next year to your presentation on crisis management. No pressure. Thank you everyone for joining us. There are the two brochures on the master's and doctoral program on the chat. We look forward to seeing you in the next presentation. Migration culture clash in the Hispanic world. The link is also in the chat, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a great day.
Thank you. I appreciate it.